shadow knows.
Friends, remember that you can continue to thrill to the adventures of the Shadow by getting the Shadow magazine at your local newsstand.
Street and Smith published 325 issues of The Shadow, plus 3 annuals. A stack of publications approximately 10.5 feet high for 18 consecutive years starting October 1, 1932. Anytime anyone wanted to escape from the drudgeries of real life into a fantastical world of magic and mystery, they could always buy an issue of that grand American institution, The Shadow magazine. The Shadow hadn't appeared on his own first cover. That issue's table of contents page showed a shadow illustration based on Street and Smith's editor-in-chief, Frank Blackwell. The next issue's cover didn't show the Shadow either. His appearance gradually began to take shape over the course of the next 4 issues, on covers painted by Jerome Rosen. On all 4, the Shadow is pictured in the lower right-hand corner as a Shadow of Wall Street-like figure in a green hood, and shown in silhouette on the cover's main scene. Jerome Rosen had a twin brother, George, who was also a painter. Both were artistic from an early age. But it was George Rosen who created the definitive Shadow by painting the Master of Darkness in a swirling black cloak and giving him a hawk-like profile. But when George Rosen was first asked to give the Shadow a hawk-like profile, he had no idea what that meant. He was referred to the ample nose of Bill Lawler, an assistant art director at Street and Smith. Rosen scoured second-hand stores looking for the perfect headgear for the Shadow, and finally found this old-fashioned slouch hat. Rosen used it on models for years. Today, the world-famous slouch hat belongs to Shadow historian Anthony Tollin. Tollin rescued it from the obscurity of the Rosen family attic. Rosen also used a dress cape that belonged to his wife as a model for the Shadow's cloak. Issue number 8 was the first cover to feature the Shadow all decked out in a slouch hat and a black cloak with blood-red lining. Rosen's concession to Smith and Street's art directors, who knew covers bathed in crimson, had a way of getting noticed on crowded, madly competitive newsstands. Newsstand owners returned unsold magazines by sending the publishers just the magazine's cover to avoid expensive mailing costs. When Street and Smith experienced problems with unscrupulous retailers ripping covers off their pulps so that they could sell the remaining coverless story at half price, the ever-inventive Walter Gibson came up with a clever solution. He tacked a short prologue onto Hands in the Dark, complete with coded street map, and had it printed right on the issue's cover. Now, shady retailers couldn't rip the cover off the issue without also discarding the beginning of the story. One year, Street and Smith wanted a Christmas cover for an issue scheduled to go on sale during the holiday season. Gibson convinced them that a dramatic scene from the issue's story, The Creeping Death, would be better. Gibson was right. The issue sold out, and George Rosen's startling living skeleton cover has since become a classic. Speaking of holidays, anyone know if the groundhog saw his shadow this year? Here's Rosen's ingenious image for the third skull, which positioned 2 human figures to form a human skull, and the cover of The Chinese Discs, which contains the secret message revealing when the issue's criminals were planning to strike. Can you decode the secret message? Look closely. Do you see it? No? Of course, it's so obvious. The answer is, the criminals plan to strike tonight. Finally, it was George Rosen who painted this, the most iconic shadow image ever created, to illustrate Walter Gibson's The Black Hush.
These crooks had devised a huge searchlight. It shot blackness instead of light. They had a place out in the country. All you had to do was fly over it with a plane. And bang, they just turned on the black hush. and they killed all the electric work in the plane, and you were done. Well, the shadow flew over in his autogyro. Well, now you know the autogyros, the way they work. That big windmill on top, it was like a parachute. So the shadow simply flew around until he knew he got the place, because all of a sudden, bang, and all his electricity is cut out, and he says, this is what I wanted, and he lands right on their damn place because he just coasted down into it. And that was when he came and finished them.
Graves Gladney began doing shadow covers in 1939 and continued for 2 years. Gladney himself sometimes modeled for other pulps. Here he is on the cover of Astounding Science Fiction. Gladney felt most pulp covers had no atmosphere and no reality to them at all. So Gladney changed the shadow's appearance slightly, patterning the new look after his own face. He also attempted to make the shadow's image more realistic by shortening his cloak and downplaying its blood-red lining. The artist frequently tried to get away with omitting the red lining altogether, but he was usually caught and had to touch up his paintings. Gladney eventually inherited a fortune and left the pulps to go hunting in Africa. He died of a heart attack in 1976. Gladney thought the best cover painting he ever did for the shadow pulp was The Crimson Death. What's your favorite shadow pulp cover? Get the pause button ready. Here's all 328 of them. Don't blink. And the covers were just the beginning, of course. Underneath their eye-catching painted covers, pulps were mainly text, with just a few black and white drawings depicting the most thrilling or dramatic moments in the stories. Most pulps began with one or more pages of advertisements. Then, after that, came a table of contents page and more ads. Then an illustrated spread with the story's title and author's byline. After that, it was mostly words, 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 with just a few drawings. Yes, people actually read back then, with no internet, no VCRs, no DVDs, no cable TV, and no television at all. They didn't have much choice. The first artist to do interiors for the shadow pulps was Tom Lavelle, who got just $12 for each drawing. Lavelle's shadow came closest to Gibson's own mental picture of the shadow, because Lavelle pictured the character as a judge-like figure of vengeance dressed in an all-black robe. Lavelle left the shadow after 4 years to become a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps. And he later became famous for his highly detailed photorealistic paintings of the American West, the Civil War, and historic battle scenes. Here's his version of the pivotal Battle of Hastings, from sketch to color rough to beautiful finished painting. Tom Lavelle shared a studio with Saturday Evening Post artist Edward Daniel Cartier, who signed his work Ed Cartier. Cartier had done numerous illustrations for other Street and Smith pulps, and he took over the shadow interiors in 1936. Cartier, born in North Bergen, New Jersey, did more than 800 interior shadow illustrations, and his work was cited by shadow comic book artist Mike Kaluta as his greatest influence. And don't worry, we'll get to the shadow comic books. We're just getting started, shadow fans. After Ed Cartier was drafted into World War II, Earl Mahan took over the shadow. Mahan used to photograph himself in the slouch hat and cloak for references to draw his version of the character. Mahan said the most important thing at all times was action. With title page illustrations especially, he favored action, mood, or horror, anything to stir the reader. Shadow interiors were also done by Paul Orban, Bob Powell, and Raymond Kinsler. Presto changeo, ladies and gentlemen, before your very eyes. The shadow, also known as Lamont Cranston, has evolved from a little scene manipulator into a full-fledged crime fighter with a network of agents, then plunged confidently into that most difficult of professions, pulp magazine hero.
After the Shadow began to go, all the other competition magazines simply said, oh, write something, let's get up a name, something like the Shadow, let's get in there all doing that. And just as they had thrilling love story, popular love story, dime love story, everything of that sort, so you naturally expected them to write the same type of stuff. The Phantom was the first, then came the Spider, then came things like Operator 5, Secret Agent X, Dr. Wu Fang.
But Gibson's Master of Darkness beat the competition as easily as he dispensed with criminals. The Shadow had conquered the Pulps, and now he was ready to make a triumphant return to the medium in which he had been born. Find out how in our next hypnotic chapter, The Invisible Shadow.